A farmer from Texas decided to drill his field in search of water. But when he looked inside and saw what was hidden underground, he immediately called the FBI. What the agents discovered shocked the entire country. Subscribe to the channel and comment below where you're watching this video from. The wind had a voice of its own that summer. It scraped across the flatlands of southern New Mexico, dragging with it dust and heat and the faint rattle of dead grass. The air shimmered above the cracked soil like a restless spirit, and even the crows had stopped calling. For miles around, there was nothing but the dull red of dying earth and the distant silhouettes of fence posts leaning like tired sentinels. In the middle of it all stood a farm, 30 acres of parched ground, a sagging barn, and a weathered house that had seen better days. It belonged to Elias Brown. Elias had lived his entire life on that stretch of land. His father and grandfather before him had raised cattle and planted cotton there, back when the water table was high and the Rio Puerco hadn't shrunk to a string of muddy ponds. Now the well was nearly dry, the fields barren. The old irrigation ditches that once carried life through the property had turned into deep, empty scars. He still woke before dawn, as his father had taught him, but there was no herd to tend, no crop to check. His hands, dark and cracked like the land itself, worked now only to keep the property from falling apart completely. The neighbors had long since given up. Some sold their land to developers who never came. Others just packed up and left under cover of night. Elias stayed. Stubbornness was something that ran deep in him, an inheritance as sure as the deed to the farm. He could still remember his grandfather, Marcus Brown, saying that land wasn't something you owned. It was something you answered to. That belief had kept Elias here even when the bank letters piled up and the price of diesel made every trip into town an act of defiance. He spent most days repairing the old tractor or cleaning the solar panels that gave him just enough electricity to run the lights at night. Sometimes he would sit on the porch at sunset, watching the heat ripple across the horizon, and think of how the land must have looked before men tried to tame it. It had its own rhythm then, slow and powerful like a sleeping animal. Now it was wounded, exhausted, but Elias couldn't bring himself to abandon it. When the last of the well water began to taste like metal, he decided to dig. He remembered stories his grandfather used to tell about an old spring that ran beneath the north field. Marcus had said it had been sealed up decades ago after a rock slide, but that there was still water down there, clean and cold. Elias figured if he could just find it, he could bring the farm back to life. It was a desperate thought, but desperation was all he had left. He borrowed an old drilling rig from a mechanic in town, patched it together with spare parts, and set to work. The machine was slow and loud, coughing out black smoke as it chewed through layers of hard-packed soil. Every few feet he'd stop, pull the drill, and check for moisture. Nothing. Just more dust. The sun blazed overhead, turning his shirt into a second skin of sweat and grit. He kept going anyway. Days passed. He dug in the mornings before the heat became unbearable, then again at dusk when the shadows stretched long and cool. The sound of the drill echoed across the empty fields, mingling with the rasp of cicadas. It was lonely work, but Elias preferred it to silence. The silence reminded him how empty the valley had become, how far the nearest voice was now. One evening, as he pushed the drill deeper into the ground, the bit struck something solid. The vibration ran up through the metal handle into his palms. He stopped the motor, listening. The sound wasn't the dull thud of rock. It was hollow, metallic. He pulled the bit up, crouched beside the hole, and scraped at the dirt with his hands. After a few minutes, his fingers brushed against cold iron. It was a plate, broad and flat, buried under almost 6 feet of packed earth. He cleared more soil away, revealing bolts along the edge. The thing was old. Rust had eaten through the surface in places, but it was clearly man-made. He leaned closer, pressed his ear against it, and tapped with a wrench. The sound that came back made him freeze. It wasn't solid earth beneath that metal. It was empty space. He sat back on his heels, staring at the exposed section of the plate. For a long time, he didn't move. The sun was slipping below the horizon, casting the field in copper light, and the air had gone strangely still. He thought of old mines, of storage tanks, of forgotten cellars. None of them made sense here, in the middle of nowhere. This part of the property had always been untouched. No records, no signs of construction. His grandfather had never mentioned anything like this. That night, he couldn't sleep. The wind howled outside, throwing sand against the windows, but beneath it, he imagined he could hear something else, a faint, rhythmic thrum, like a heartbeat deep under the soil. He told himself it was the wind in the dry roots or the echo of his imagination. But the feeling wouldn't leave him. The next morning, he went back with a shovel and started to uncover the rest of the object. The sun rose high, burning the back of his neck, but he kept working. After several hours, the full outline came into view. It wasn't just a plate, it was a hatch, circular, about 3 feet wide, with a recessed handle nearly hidden under rust. A hatch meant an entrance. Someone had built something down there. Elias sat on the edge of the pit, breathing heavily. He thought about covering it back up, pretending he'd never seen it. But curiosity has a way of digging its own holes. He climbed out of the trench, went to the barn, and found a long steel bar. Using it as leverage, he tried to pry at the hatch. It didn't budge. He looped a chain through the handle, hooked it to the tractor, and eased the machine forward. The chain tightened, creaked, then snapped with a sound that made his heart jolt. Frustrated, he stared down at the unmoving hatch. Whatever was under there had been sealed for a reason, and sealed well. But now that he knew it existed, he couldn't let it go. He decided to wait until the evening, when the heat would ease, and try again. When the sun dipped low, he returned with a fresh chain and more determination than sense. This time, he hitched it twice, wrapped the links around the axle, and gunned the engine. The tractor roared, the chain groaned, and suddenly the hatch gave a violent shudder. A cloud of dust erupted as it tore free. The sound that followed was deep and unsettling, a sigh from the earth itself. Elias shut off the engine. The air coming from the opening was cool, damp, and faintly metallic. He peered inside, shining his flashlight down. The beam caught on a ladder made of corroded iron rungs descending into darkness. The walls looked smooth, too smooth for natural rock. He felt a twist in his gut, equal parts excitement and dread. He lowered himself carefully, testing each rung. The air grew colder as he descended, and the smell changed, less like soil, more like oil and concrete. The flashlight beam bounced off the walls, revealing what looked like poured cement, streaked with rust. After about 20 feet, his boots hit solid ground. He turned slowly, sweeping the light around. He stood in a narrow corridor, maybe 6 feet wide. The floor was hard-packed earth, but the walls were lined with metal sheeting, bolted in place. A network of old wires ran along the ceiling, disappearing into holes cut into the wall. Everything was silent except for the drip of water somewhere in the distance. He took a few steps forward. His light caught on an object, a metal crate half buried in the dirt. He brushed it off. The label had peeled away, but faint letters remained. Proyecto Norte, 1992. Spanish. He frowned, running a hand over the box. Inside were scraps of plastic and what looked like the remnants of electrical parts. Further down, the corridor split in two. One path angled upward, the other sloped deeper underground. He hesitated. Every instinct told him to turn back, to leave whatever this was alone. But there was something magnetic about the place, something that pulled at him. He followed the downward path. The walls here were covered in grime, and his footsteps echoed hollowly. In one alcove, he found an overturned metal chair and a table coated in dust. On the floor lay a broken headset and an empty bottle. Everything looked abandoned, yet not ancient, perhaps only a few years old. He moved cautiously, feeling as if the tunnel itself were holding its breath. When the corridor finally ended, he found himself in a small chamber no bigger than his kitchen. A rusted generator sat in one corner, still connected to a tangle of wires. A faded first aid box hung from a nail, its contents long expired. It looked like the remains of a place that had once been alive with purpose and had since been forgotten. He turned back. The flashlight flickered, casting strange shadows on the walls. For a moment, he thought he heard something, a soft scrape, like movement far ahead. But when he froze, the sound stopped. It might have been the echo of his own boots, or something else. By the time he climbed out of the hole, the sun had already sunk below the hills. The sky burned orange, fading into violet, and the first stars began to appear. Elias stood beside the open hatch, breathing hard, his hands trembling. He looked at the dark mouth in the ground and felt the weight of something vast pressing beneath his feet. That night, he sat at the kitchen table staring at the phone. He had no proof of what he'd found, just a feeling that it mattered. A hatch sealed for decades, a tunnel carved with precision, concrete, and wiring deep below his farm. It all pointed to something deliberate, something secret. At last, he picked up the receiver and dialed the local sheriff's office. When the deputy answered, Elias told him he'd found an old structure underground and that someone should probably take a look. The man sounded skeptical but promised to send someone in the morning. Elias hung up, turned off the lights, and went to bed. But sleep didn't come. Outside, the desert wind rose again, moaning against the walls. Somewhere in the distance, thunder flickered without rain. And beneath it all, if he listened hard enough, he could still hear it. That faint, steady pulse under the ground, like the land itself was alive and breathing. He didn't know it yet, but that sound was the beginning of something far larger than his farm, far older than the drought, and far more dangerous than anything he had ever faced. It was the sound of a secret waiting to be unearthed. And, by uncovering that rusted hatch, Elias Brown had just opened the first door to it. Morning came without color. The sun rose behind a film of dust and turned the sky the color of bone, and the farm seemed quieter than usual, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Elias stood by the open pit where the hatch gaped in the hard soil, his shadow stretching long across the ground. The air that came from below was still cool, faintly metallic, and it carried with it a smell that was not of earth but of something old and sealed away. He hadn't slept, not really. The night had passed in restless waves of thought, memories of his grandfather, of stories about hidden springs, and of the rhythmic pulse he thought he'd heard under the ground. He wanted to believe he'd imagined it, but now, standing over the open mouth of the tunnel, he wasn't so sure. The hatch was rusted but thick, built with a precision that didn't belong to farmers or ranchers. He ran his fingers over the metal rim. Whoever had placed it here had wanted it to stay hidden. The bolts were industrial, the hinges built to bear weight. There was purpose in its design. Elias fetched his flashlight again, checking that the batteries hadn't died overnight. Then, after a moment of hesitation that stretched too long, he swung his legs over the edge and began to climb down once more. The ladder was slick with condensation. His boots squeaked against the iron rungs. This time he counted each step. 21 down, then the bottom. The beam of his flashlight cut through the dark, tracing along the concrete walls. The air was colder today, the silence deeper. A single droplet of water fell from the ceiling, its echo magnified in the stillness. Elias turned in a slow circle, recognizing the same narrow corridor he'd found before. His footprints from the night before were still visible in the dust, leading forward and branching left where the tunnel split. He decided to go the other way this time, the path that angled upward. It was narrower, the ceiling lower, and the air smelled faintly of fuel. The walls bore scratches, not random gouges, but marks made by tools, as though someone had carved or widened the passage long after it was built. He ran his hand along one of them, feeling the grooves beneath his fingertips. They were fresh enough that flakes of concrete still clung loose. Someone had been here recently. The thought made him stop. He turned off the flashlight and stood still in the dark, listening. At first, there was only silence, then, maybe, a faint hum. Not a sound of movement or breath, but something mechanical, far off. He couldn't tell if it came from deeper in the tunnel or from inside his own head. When he turned the light back on, the beam flickered once, as if disturbed by a tremor of unseen air, before steadying again. The passage led him into a small chamber, its walls slick with moisture. A rusted drum sat in one corner, half full of something that glistened like oil. Nearby lay a coil of electrical cable, brittle with age. He knelt, brushing aside the dust. On the floor beneath the cable, carved into the concrete, were words in faded red paint. Proyecto Norte. He mouthed the words silently, remembering the label on the crate he had seen before. Whatever this was, it had a name. A narrow duct branched off from the chamber, too small for a man to crawl through, but Elias shone his light inside. The beam illuminated a maze of pipes and wires vanishing into darkness. It looked like ventilation or some kind of power conduit. The precision unnerved him. It wasn't the work of smugglers or casual laborers. Someone with engineering knowledge had built this. He took a slow breath and turned back toward the main corridor, deciding that was far enough. On his way out, his light caught something metallic embedded in the wall, a small box with a cracked glass cover. Beneath the glass was a dial, its needle motionless, some kind of gauge, maybe for pressure or air quality. He wiped the surface clean and saw, faintly stamped into the metal, the letters U.S. Surg, followed by a serial number. The presence of English markings beside Spanish ones deepened the mystery. If this place had been built by the government, why hide it on private land? If not, then who had access to such equipment? By the time Elias climbed back into the sunlight, the heat of the day had settled over the land like a heavy cloak. He stood there for a long while, staring at the hatch. It looked harmless now, just another piece of rusted machinery abandoned in the desert. But he knew better. He could feel the weight of whatever lay beneath him pressing upward, silent and patient. He went to the barn, found a piece of tarp, and covered the opening. It was the only thing he could think to do. As he fastened it down with rocks, he caught himself glancing over his shoulder more than once, half expecting to see someone watching from the edge of the field. but the land was empty as ever, nothing but the hiss of wind through the dry grass. Inside the house, the air was stifling. He poured himself a glass of water, drank half, and set it down, staring out the window toward the spot where the tarp now lay. He should call someone again, he thought. The sheriff. Or maybe the county inspector, maybe even the news station in town. But he knew what that would bring: curiosity, questions, and the kind of attention a man like him didn't need. People didn't trust what they didn't understand, and in this part of New Mexico, a black farmer claiming he'd found a secret underground tunnel would sound more like a ghost story than a report. Still, the thought of leaving it alone gnawed at him. Late that afternoon, he gathered his courage once more. He took his flashlight, a fresh battery pack, and a coil of rope, and returned to the pit. The tarp flapped weakly in the wind, as if something below was exhaling. He pulled it aside, lowered himself down, and followed the main tunnel deeper this time. The air grew denser the further he went. Dust hung thick in the beam of his light, swirling like mist. The walls were marked with streaks of grime that glistened faintly, and here and there he saw signs of repair. New bolts, fresh concrete patches, all too recent to belong to the past century. He passed the chamber with the table and the first aid kit, but this time he noticed something he had missed before. A narrow doorway set into the opposite wall, half hidden behind a sheet of rusted metal. He pushed it aside. The doorway opened into another passage, wider than the first. The ceiling was reinforced with beams, and along one side ran a series of shallow recesses, storage alcoves, perhaps. In one of them, he found a line of empty crates stacked neatly, each marked with coded labels. The floor was covered in a fine layer of dust, but beneath that dust, faint footprints were visible. They weren't his. A chill moved up his spine. He crouched to examine them. The prints were recent, the edges sharp. A few led deeper into the tunnel, disappearing around a bend. He straightened, listening again, but there was only the sound of his own heartbeat. He should have turned back. Instead, he followed them. Around the corner, the tunnel widened into a large chamber. His light swept across the walls and caught something metallic in the distance. A control panel, half collapsed but still connected to bundles of wire that vanished into the floor. On the panel were switches, labels, and meters, all coated with grime. The words were in both English and Spanish. He approached slowly, touched one of the levers, and felt the metal tremble slightly under his fingers. It was alive, not with power, but with the memory of it. Next to the panel was a desk, its surface littered with old papers. Most were water-damaged and illegible, but one sheet had survived, trapped beneath a glass weight. It was a schematic, a rough blueprint of interconnected corridors. Elias squinted at it, the lines spread out like roots, branching far beyond what he had seen so far. Some extended north, others east. One even seemed to pass under the nearby highway. Each line was labeled with a code S3, W2, main conduit. At the top corner of the page was a stamp. Confidential. Elias's pulse quickened. He folded the paper carefully, slipped it into his jacket, and took one last look around. The chamber was silent but for the faint hum again, steady now, rhythmic, as though some machine deep below was still running. He turned to leave, his flashlight trembling slightly in his hand. When he climbed back to the surface, the sun was setting behind a wall of red dust. The sky glowed like fire, and the air vibrated with distant thunder. He felt a heaviness in his chest. Not fear, not yet, but something close. He covered the hatch again, weighing the tarp down with stones until it looked as though the earth had never been disturbed. Then he went inside, locked the door, and sat at the table as the darkness gathered outside. He took out the blueprint and spread it under the lamp. The lines crisscrossed in ways that didn't make sense, converging beneath places he recognized: his neighbor's land, the old road, even the dry riverbed. If the drawing was accurate, this network wasn't small. It stretched for miles. He leaned back in his chair, staring at it, and for the first time in years the old farmhouse felt alien to him, as though it stood not on solid ground but on the thin crust above something vast and hidden. He didn't hear the sound right away. It was subtle at first, a distant vibration that seemed to come from the floor itself. The lamp flickered. The glass in the window rattled softly. Then it was gone, leaving only the creak of the boards and the steady ticking of the clock. Elias looked toward the pit again, though he couldn't see it from here. Something below was moving. He barely slept that night. When he did drift off, he dreamed of ladders descending endlessly, of corridors lit by the flicker of unseen lights, of voices echoing through the dark in languages he couldn't understand. When he woke before dawn, the first thing he did was look out the window. The tarp was still there, unmoved. Yet he had the unshakable sense that the ground beneath it had changed somehow, that what lay below was no longer asleep. As the first pale light spread across the desert, Elias made a decision. He would call the authorities again. Not the local sheriff this time, but the county office, maybe even the federal line. Whatever was buried under his land was bigger than him, bigger than this valley, and he wanted no part in keeping it secret. He reached for the phone, his hand trembling slightly. Before he could dial, he paused. Out the window, on the far side of his property, a column of dust rose into the air. It might have been the wind, or it might have been a vehicle leaving, one he hadn't heard arrive. He watched it drift away until it vanished into the horizon. Then he turned back to the phone and finished dialing. When the voice on the other end answered, calm and official, Elias told them everything: the hatch, the tunnels, the strange markings, the blueprint. The man asked for his address, told him to stay put, and said a team would be sent immediately. There was something in the man's tone that was both reassuring and cold, like a doctor explaining a necessary amputation. Elias hung up and sat in silence, staring at his hands. Outside, the wind rose again, carrying with it the dry, hollow breath of the desert. The tarp over the pit rippled slightly, and for a moment it almost looked as if the earth itself was breathing. He didn't know it then, but by calling for help, he had just invited the storm that would consume everything he thought he understood about his land, his family, and the country he lived in. When the first distant hum of engines reached his ears an hour later, Elias Brown stepped out onto his porch and waited, watching as a line of unmarked vehicles rolled toward his farm through the shimmering heat. The men who climbed out wore no badges, no names. Only the sunlight glinted off their black visors as they walked toward him, carrying equipment that looked far too advanced for a county investigation. Elias's throat went dry. The leader stopped a few feet away, his shadow falling across the cracked earth between them. "Mr. Brown," the man said in a clipped voice, "we'll take it from here." Elias nodded, though he didn't understand what it was anymore. He stepped aside as they moved past him, their boots stirring dust that shimmered in the rising heat. He watched as they surrounded the hatch, tore away the tarp, and began to descend one by one into the darkness he had uncovered. The sound of their radios crackled faintly in the air, a language of static and code. For the first time since finding the hatch, Elias felt a flicker of relief. Maybe they would explain it all. Maybe there was a reason for what he'd found. But as the last man disappeared below and the sun climbed higher, that relief began to fade. The vehicles bore no insignia, the men spoke to no one, and when the wind shifted, Elias thought he heard the faint sound of machinery starting up deep beneath his fields. Machinery that hadn't been silent at all, only waiting for someone to return. By evening, when the agents had vanished as quietly as they'd come, leaving behind only tire marks and the faint smell of fuel, Elias understood that something had changed forever. The hatch was no longer his secret, but neither was it safe. What lay beneath his land now belonged to forces he couldn't name, and though the desert looked the same, he knew its silence had been broken. The earth, once still and lifeless, was awake, and somewhere below, the tunnels he'd stumbled into were stirring once more, whispering of things he had never meant to find. By dawn, the horizon looked bruised, dark streaks of purple clouds hanging low over the desert like smoke that refused to rise. Elias sat on his porch, boots planted firmly on the worn wooden steps, watching the last of the dust settle from the convoy that had come and gone the previous night. The vehicles had disappeared into the distance hours ago, their lights shrinking to embers before vanishing entirely, leaving behind silence that didn't feel natural anymore. He hadn't been able to sleep since. Every sound in the dark, the creak of the house, the cry of a night bird, made him glance towards the pit behind the barn. The hatch was uncovered now, surrounded by fresh tire tracks and footprints from the men who had descended into the earth. They had not spoken to him when they left, not even to say goodbye. They had packed their equipment, sealed their containers, and driven off as though erasing their presence from the land. At first, Elias had thought it was over. Whatever they had been looking for, maybe they'd found it. Maybe they had finished their work, but as the morning deepened, the low growl of engines returned, not from the highway, but from across the field. This time there were more vehicles, different ones, white trucks with government plates and black SUVs without markings. They rolled up the dirt road in a slow, deliberate line, kicking up dust that shimmered in the sunlight. When they stopped, doors opened in perfect sequence, and men in uniforms spilled out, some in local sheriff colors, others in dark tactical gear with the letters FBI faintly visible on their backs. Elias rose slowly, his heart thudding in his chest. A tall man in a wide-brimmed hat approached first, hand resting near his belt. "Mr. Brown," he called out, voice carrying easily through the dry air, "you'll need to stay back from the property for the time being." Elias frowned, stepping off the porch. "This is my land." "I understand, sir. It's now part of an active federal investigation. We'll take it from here." The phrase again. He was beginning to hate it. Within minutes, they had erected barriers at the edge of his field. Portable fencing, bright yellow tape that flapped weakly in the breeze. Another team unloaded tents, generators, and floodlights. The hum of diesel engines soon filled the air. Elias watched in disbelief as his quiet, dying farm was transformed into something that looked more like a military outpost. The men moved with purpose, unrolling cables, hammering stakes into the ground, carrying equipment towards the pit where the hatch lay. No one spoke to him again. By noon, 2 helicopters appeared overhead, circling slowly, their rotors chopping the air into a deafening rhythm. Dust swirled around the yard, coating his porch and windows in fine grit. A man in a dark suit approached him, clipboard in hand. He was polite but distant, his voice measured, his eyes unreadable. "Mr. Brown, we appreciate your cooperation," he said. "For your safety, we're asking that you remain in the house until further notice. You may experience restricted access to certain parts of your property." "Restricted?" Elias repeated. "You can't just—" "National security," the man interrupted gently, but with a finality that left no room for argument. He handed Elias a form that might as well have been written in another language. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the swarm of agents and soldiers now crawling over the farm. The rest of the day unfolded like a dream he couldn't wake from. Trucks arrived carrying equipment that looked too heavy and too complex for simple excavation. Machines with long sensors, metallic arms, and blinking consoles. He saw men in hazmat suits descend into the hatch, their suits gleaming under the floodlights. Later, others followed carrying sealed cases marked with red biohazard symbols. No one explained anything. By late afternoon, the media vans arrived. They parked along the county road, their cameras pointed toward the farm, reporters talking animatedly into microphones while dust whipped around them. From his porch, Elias could see them gesturing toward his land, mouths moving, but words drowned out by the wind. Then a group of uniformed officers arrived to push them back, setting up a perimeter. Within hours, access roads leading to his property were blocked entirely. It wasn't just his land that was changing. The entire community began to buzz with rumor. His phone rang constantly, neighbors calling to ask what was happening, whether it was true that they'd found drugs, or a collapsed mine or a mass grave. One man from town asked if Elias was under arrest. Another whispered that he should get a lawyer. Each call left him more drained than the last, until he simply stopped answering. That night, the field burned with artificial light. The flood lamps illuminated the entire valley, turning the desert into a blinding stage. Helicopters hovered intermittently, their searchlights slicing through the darkness. Elias stood at his window watching as figures moved like insects around the pit. Somewhere down there, the hatch he had opened was now surrounded by fences and equipment, guarded by men with rifles. His discovery was no longer his. It belonged to something larger, colder. Around midnight, there was a knock on his door. When he opened it, 2 agents stood outside. One of them handed him a sealed envelope. "Official notice," he said curtly. "Your residence is within the operational perimeter. We'll need to move you to temporary housing until the investigation concludes." Elias's stomach tightened. "How long will that take?" "Unclear at this time," the agent replied. "I'm not leaving my land." The man looked at him, expression unreadable. "Mr. Brown, this isn't a request." They left him standing there, the envelope heavy in his hand. He didn't open it. He sat at the table instead, staring at the single photograph on the wall, his grandfather, young and proud, standing beside the same barn that now cast its shadow over soldiers' tents. Marcus Brown had built this place with his own hands. To see it swallowed by fences and floodlights felt like a betrayal. The next morning, he woke to the sound of machinery. From the window, he saw a line of black SUVs parked near the barn. Men in body armor were carrying long cases toward the pit. There was shouting, the clatter of metal. A faint smell of oil and ozone hung in the air. Elias stepped outside, shielding his eyes from the glare of the floodlights that had burned all night. He noticed something strange. The agents were moving faster now, their voices sharper, as if something urgent had been discovered below. Before he could ask what was happening, 2 armed guards appeared and blocked his path. "Sir, you need to stay back." He stopped where he was, watching as more men emerged from the hatch, their faces pale beneath their helmets. One of them carried a small object sealed in a clear plastic case. The others followed, their movements hurried but controlled. They loaded the case into a waiting truck, which roared off almost immediately, leaving behind a swirl of dust. Hours later, as the sun climbed higher, a new group arrived, scientists or engineers judging by their equipment. They carried instruments that emitted low beeping sounds, sweeping them across the ground like metal detectors. One of them stopped near the house and frowned at the readings. Another joined him, speaking quietly. Moments later, both hurried back toward the pit. By afternoon, the entire area was cordoned off with new fencing. Elias's farmhouse now stood inside a secured zone, isolated like an island in a sea of metal and machinery. The agents came again, this time with a vehicle and an order bearing an official seal. "You'll have to come with us now," one said. Elias refused. They didn't argue. Instead, they left 2 guards at his gate and drove off. He could see them talking into radios, their eyes always drifting toward the pit. Something had changed underground, something they weren't ready to admit. That evening, as the sky turned copper and the hum of generators filled the air, Elias slipped out the back door. He moved quietly along the fence line, keeping low. Near the far edge of the field, where the light from the flood lamps faded, he crouched and listened. Beneath the mechanical hum, he could hear faint voices echoing up from below, urgent, echoing, impossible to make out. Then a sharp metallic sound rang out, followed by silence. The floodlights flickered once, twice, then steadied again. He backed away, heart pounding. Whatever they had found down there, it was not just dirt and rock. When he returned to the house, 2 neighbors stood outside the gate, Tom and Linda Perez, who owned the small ranch down the road. They looked anxious, their truck headlights cutting through the haze. "Elias," Tom called out, "what's going on out here? The highway's closed, and they've got soldiers turning people around. Folks are saying you found something dangerous." Elias shook his head. "I don't know. They won't tell me anything." Linda looked over his shoulder toward the bright lights. "They say it might be nuclear or chemical. That's why they've got those suits." "That's nonsense," Elias said, though he wasn't sure. "I found a tunnel, that's all." Tom glanced at the pit. "A tunnel doesn't bring the FBI and the Army, Elias." He didn't answer. After a long pause, the couple got back in their truck and drove off, the red glow of their taillights fading into the dark. Elias watched them go, feeling a cold weight settle in his chest. That night, as the floodlights hummed and the wind swept across the fields, he tried to sleep but couldn't. Around 2 in the morning, a sudden vibration shook the ground. The lamps outside flickered again. Then came a low rumble, deep and continuous, like the growl of something enormous waking from slumber. He rushed to the window, but the light was blinding. He could only see shapes moving frantically near the pit. A column of dust erupted upward, illuminated by the floodlights. Then, as suddenly as it began, everything went still. The next morning, the agents were gone. Every truck, every tent, every light had vanished, leaving only ruts in the dirt and scattered debris. Even the fences had been removed. The pit behind the barn was sealed again, this time not with the old hatch, but with a thick layer of fresh concrete. Someone had worked through the night to erase all traces. Elias stood there, staring at the pale gray slab that now marked the spot. His land was silent again, eerily so. The only sound was the wind sighing through the empty barn. For the first time, he realized how completely powerless he was. Whatever had been under his farm no longer belonged to him, or to anyone he could name. That afternoon, he drove into town for supplies, but people stared as he passed. Conversations stopped when he entered the store. The cashier smiled too tightly, and someone whispered behind him, "That's the man with the tunnels." By evening, he turned back toward home, feeling more a stranger in his own town than he ever had before. When he reached his gate, he saw fresh tire tracks on the road that hadn't been there that morning. He followed them to the edge of the sealed pit. Someone had been here while he was gone. He knelt, pressing his hand to the cool surface of the concrete, and felt it, faint but unmistakable, a vibration, like something alive moving far below. The land was quiet on the surface, but beneath it he could feel the pulse returning, steady and patient. The men had gone, the lights were gone, the fences were gone, but whatever they had awakened down there was still breathing. And in that moment, Elias understood that his farm had not been liberated at all. It was under siege, only now the invader was invisible, buried deep under his feet, waiting for the next command to rise. For the next several days, the desert seemed to hold its breath. The noise and chaos that had consumed Elias's farm vanished so completely, it was as if none of it had ever happened. The wind erased tire tracks, the fences were gone, and the only sign of the invasion was the new slab of concrete gleaming pale against the sun. Yet, beneath that surface silence, something had shifted. Elias felt it in the air, in the stillness of the nights, in the way even the animals seemed to avoid the north field now. The land that had always felt like part of him had turned unfamiliar, as though it belonged to someone else, or something else entirely. On the third night after the government teams left, Elias sat by the window, unable to sleep. The moon hung low and full, silvering the fields in light. His gaze drifted towards the sealed pit. It looked harmless, ordinary even, just another scar on a broken farm. But as he watched, he saw a faint shimmer of movement. Heat waves, he thought at first, until he realized there was no heat at all. The air above the slab seemed to ripple, then settle again. It might have been his imagination, but he knew better than to trust comfort now. He stepped outside barefoot, the boards of the porch cool beneath his feet, and stood listening. The night was utterly silent. Too silent. He didn't remember deciding to cross the yard, but his legs carried him forward. Each step was measured, slow. The wind had died. Not even the insects sang. When he reached the concrete, he knelt, laid a hand flat against it, and felt it. Faint, rhythmic, steady, a vibration. There was movement below, too deep to hear but strong enough to sense. He withdrew his hand quickly, heart pounding. Something was alive down there, or active at least. The thought chilled him more than the night air ever could. The following morning, Elias called the sheriff's office again. The deputy who answered sounded young, uncertain, and when Elias described what had happened, the man hesitated before replying that he'd make a note of it. There was no follow-up call, no visit. It was clear now that the matter of the tunnels had been lifted out of local hands long ago. He was alone in this. Over the next week, Elias noticed small changes around the farm. The soil near the sealed area seemed softer, darker, as if moisture was rising from beneath. The air there had a faint metallic tang, like the scent that lingers after a lightning storm. Twice he found small depressions in the ground that hadn't been there the day before, each about the size of a dinner plate, shallow but precise. Once, he caught a glint of something metallic in one of them, though when he brushed the dirt away, there was nothing. By the second week, his unease had hardened into something closer to resolve. Whatever had been built under his land, whoever had come to hide it, it was not gone. They had simply buried the entrance and left their secret to fester. He began keeping a journal, noting times, temperatures, tremors, and sounds. He wanted proof, something real that could not be dismissed as paranoia. Late one night, while writing by the dim light of a lamp, Elias heard it again. The hum. Faint, steady, mechanical. It rose through the floorboards like the purr of a distant engine. He turned off the lamp and listened. After several minutes, the hum grew stronger, and this time he felt it vibrating in the soles of his feet. He stepped outside and followed it, drawn toward the old barn. The barn had always been his grandfather's pride, a place of work and warmth, now decayed by time and neglect. Inside, the smell of dust and old hay filled his nose. The hum was louder here, more distinct. He moved carefully through the darkness, past the rusted tools and broken crates, until he reached the far wall. The sound seemed to come from behind it. He pressed his palm to the wood and felt the vibration coursing through. When he leaned closer, he could hear something else beneath the mechanical pulse, a low whoosh, like air being forced through vents. He found his grandfather's old crowbar in a corner, pried at the boards, and watched as one came loose with a groan. Behind it was not earth, as he'd expected, but metal, smooth, cold, and seamless, stretching from floor to ceiling. He tapped it with the crowbar, and the hollow clang that answered nearly made him drop it. This wasn't just a wall, it was a barrier. The vibration now felt stronger, as if whatever machine operated behind it had sensed his touch. Elias stepped back, heart hammering. For a long moment, he considered sealing the wall again and walking away. But curiosity was stronger than fear, and so was anger. He found a flashlight, swept it along the metal surface, and saw a faint outline of a seam, perfectly vertical like a hidden door. At eye level, a small circular panel was embedded into the metal. Its center bore a faint red glow. He reached out instinctively, and the light changed to green. There was a soft hiss, followed by a deep click. The panel slid aside. Behind it, a tunnel sloped downward into darkness. The air that came out was stale but cool, and it carried the same metallic scent he'd smelled by the sealed hatch. His mind raced. Had the agents missed this entrance? Or had they left it on purpose, hidden in plain sight? The thought sent a shiver through him. Still, he descended. The tunnel was narrow at first, just enough for him to move upright, but after several yards it widened. The walls were smooth concrete, lined with steel struts, the floor solid, almost polished. Electrical conduits ran along both sides, humming faintly with residual energy. Every few feet, dim lights flickered to life as he passed, as though motion sensors had been waiting for a signal. Soon, he realized he was moving through a space far larger and more intricate than he could have imagined. The passage opened into a massive chamber, a cathedral of concrete buried under his farm. The air was still and heavy. He swept the flashlight across the vast room, and what it revealed made his breath catch. Along the walls were dozens of doorways leading to smaller corridors. Metal catwalks crisscrossed above, connecting platforms and observation decks. The floor was littered with abandoned equipment. Crates, tools, oxygen tanks, computer terminals coated in dust. Some machines still blinked faintly, tiny lights winking like the last stars before dawn. Elias moved forward slowly, overwhelmed by the scale. This wasn't a tunnel. It was a facility, a base. The realization settled over him like a weight. He could hear the faint hum of ventilation somewhere overhead, the steady drip of condensation falling from pipes. When his light passed over a large sign painted on the far wall, his stomach clenched. The words were faded, but still legible. Sector 12, Northern Access. He explored cautiously, moving from one chamber to another. Each was different. One held rows of cots and lockers, a makeshift barracks. Another contained tables, shelves, and sealed boxes labeled with codes he didn't recognize. There was even a room with a small kitchen set up. Cold stoves, stacked cans of food long past expiration, and empty water containers. In another area, he found what looked like a command center. A line of computer consoles stretched across the far wall, most dark, but a few flickered weakly with static light. The screens were old, their casings yellowed with age, yet the technology seemed advanced for their time. He leaned closer to one and saw a cursor blinking beside words written in Spanish. Entrada principal, cerrada, nivel de energía estable. He didn't speak much Spanish, but he understood enough. Main entrance closed, energy level stable. His stomach tightened. That meant something below was still active. He continued through the network of corridors, each leading deeper underground. The scale was beyond comprehension. Hundreds of yards of reinforced tunnels branching in every direction. Some areas were caved in, while others looked newly repaired. In one section, he found a storage room filled with sealed crates, each stamped with a warning, "No abrir sin autorización." He pried one open with a piece of metal. Inside were cylindrical containers, sleek and silver, each fitted with wiring. He didn't dare touch them. In another room, he found personal effects, photographs, books, children's drawings tacked to the walls. Families had lived here, or at least stayed long enough to leave traces of ordinary life. One photograph showed a group of people standing in a corridor much like this one, smiling, holding tools. Behind them on the wall hung a flag, not of any nation Elias recognized, but a black banner marked with a simple white emblem, 3 intersecting circles. He stared at it, a chill creeping down his spine. Whoever they were, they had been organized, purposeful. At the far end of the main corridor, he came to a heavy steel door that stood slightly ajar. The space beyond was unlike any other he had seen. It was vast, almost cavernous, and filled with structures, walls and walkways and pillars that looked like the skeleton of an underground city. Faint emergency lights glowed along the perimeter, bathing everything in an eerie red hue. Elias walked slowly into the open space, the sound of his footsteps swallowed by the immensity. There were buildings down here, actual structures made of concrete and steel, with doors and windows and stairways leading nowhere. Some had numbers painted on them. Others bore signs in multiple languages. It was as if someone had tried to recreate the surface world underground. But why? He moved through narrow alleys between the structures, shining his light through broken windows. Inside one, he saw computers, chairs, maps on the walls. Another contained bunks arranged in perfect rows. Everything was coated in dust, but the air felt strangely clean, as if the place were still ventilated. When he reached the far side of the chamber, he noticed something unusual. A section of floor had been cut open, revealing a lower level. A faint blue light glowed from below. He crouched beside the opening and peered down. There were cables running deep into the ground, pulsing with that same subtle vibration he had felt through the concrete above. The machinery wasn't dead. It was sleeping. He suddenly realized how quiet it was. The hum he'd heard before had faded. The only sound now was his own breathing, and then, faintly, another. A shuffle, a metallic scrape. He froze, flashlight trembling in his hand. The sound came again, closer this time, from somewhere in the maze of structures behind him. He turned, slowly, the beam of his light cutting through the gloom. Nothing moved, but he could feel it now, a presence. He wasn't alone. Fear surged up cold and electric. He backed away from the hole, keeping the light steady. The sound stopped as suddenly as it had begun. For a long moment, the silence was total. Then, from the far end of the chamber, one of the computer screens flickered on, its green glow spreading faintly across the room. Lines of text scrolled across it in a language he couldn't read, then vanished. Elias's heart pounded. Someone, or something, was still controlling this place. He turned and began retracing his steps, moving quickly but quietly through the corridors. As he passed the living quarters, he noticed something he hadn't before. The dust on the floor had been disturbed. There were footprints again, fresh and distinct, leading away from him toward another passage. He didn't follow them. He ran. By the time he reached the tunnel that led back to the barn, his lungs were burning. He climbed the incline, scrambled through the metal panel, and shoved the wooden boards back into place. Then he bolted the barn door shut and leaned against it, shaking. The silence that followed felt almost merciful. When he finally stepped outside, the dawn was breaking over the desert. The light washed the land in pale gold, and for a fleeting moment, everything looked normal again. The fields, the fence posts, the endless sky. But Elias knew better. Beneath that fragile calm lay a city built in secret, humming with life long after its builders had vanished. A city that had been hidden under his feet for decades, perhaps longer. He went back to the house and sat at the kitchen table, staring at his shaking hands. The enormity of what he had found pressed against him like the weight of the earth itself. He thought of the sealed hatch the government had poured shut, of the men who had come and gone, and he understood now that they had never intended to destroy what was below. They had only sealed one door to it, leaving others open. Outside, the wind began to rise again, scattering the dust across the fields. It whispered through the cracks of the house like a warning. A voice carried up from the depths. Elias listened, and though he couldn't make out the words, he knew their meaning. The tunnels were not abandoned. They were waiting. The morning after Elias's descent into the underground city began like every other, but nothing felt familiar anymore. The sunlight that once spilled gently over the fields now seemed thin and strained, as if it struggled to reach the surface through the weight of what lay beneath. Even the air smelled different, drier, sharper, carrying faint metallic undertones that had never been there before. Elias moved slowly through his house, haunted by the images of what he had seen underground. The sleeping machines, the empty bunks, the dust-coated photographs of people who had lived beneath his land like ghosts, pretending to be human. He couldn't shake the feeling that by walking into that buried world, he had disturbed something that was never meant to be disturbed again. He sat at the kitchen table with a cup of cold coffee, staring at the blueprint he had retrieved days earlier. Now it made more sense. The branching lines that had once seemed random clearly corresponded to the corridors and chambers he had seen. There were even markings that hinted at deeper levels, ones he hadn't reached. At the top corner, he noticed a set of initials he had missed before. MB. His heart froze for a moment. Marcus Brown, his grandfather's name. The initials were written in the same strong, slanted handwriting that appeared in the old farm ledger he kept in a drawer. Elias felt a tremor pass through him. How could his grandfather's signature be on a document tied to that labyrinth beneath the earth? Had Marcus known about the tunnels all along? The possibility seemed absurd, but the more Elias thought about it, the less impossible it became. His grandfather had always been secretive about certain parts of the farm, especially the northern acreage. Elias remembered being a boy and asking why they never plowed that field, why it was left wild while the rest of the land was cultivated. Marcus had smiled in that guarded way of his and said, "Some ground's better left alone, boy." That memory struck him like a spark in the dark. Marcus hadn't been warning him about poor soil or superstition. He'd been telling him the truth. Something was buried there, something he had agreed to keep hidden. Elias rose abruptly and went to the closet where he kept the old records from his grandfather's time. The ledger was there, along with a metal box containing letters, receipts, and faded photographs. He spread them across the table, searching for anything that might explain the connection. For an hour, he found nothing but fragments of a hard life. Notes on cattle feed, equipment costs, weather patterns, and loans. Then, tucked between two folded receipts, he found a document that didn't fit with the rest. It was a contract printed on thick paper yellowed with age. The header bore a government seal, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and the date, 1986. Below that, typed in neat block letters, was a clause authorizing limited subterranean construction and soil reinforcement on Marcus Brown's property. The stated purpose was geological testing and water table assessment. But the language that followed was dense, full of legal phrases about restricted access, non-disclosure, and federal oversight. At the bottom, above the signature line, were the words, "Compensation for participation, $8,000. Marcus's signature was there, clear as day, and beside it, one more, illegible but marked only with the initials DR. Elias read the document 3 times before he let it fall to the table. $8,000. That was all it had taken to let them carve a secret beneath his family's land. He didn't blame his grandfather entirely. Times had been hard in the 80s, and Marcus had been drowning in debt after a string of dry seasons. But what he couldn't forgive was the silence. Marcus had taken the money and then built his life over that silence, pretending the land was just land while something vast and hidden spread beneath it. He spent the rest of the morning pacing the house, unable to think clearly. The knowledge had poisoned the air around him. The farm, once a symbol of his family's endurance, now felt like a lie, a facade built on deceit and danger. He thought of the people who had lived underground, the children whose drawings still hung on the walls of that secret city, and he wondered whether they, too, had been victims of the same deception. By afternoon, his thoughts turned darker. If the government had been involved back then, why had they sealed everything now? Why erase their own work? Maybe something had gone wrong, something that couldn't be contained. The way the agents had rushed to cover the hatch, the urgency in their movements, the quiet panic, it all made sense now. Whatever they had built down there had become a liability, a secret too dangerous to leave exposed. But instead of dismantling it, they had buried it alive, like an infection sealed under scar tissue. He went outside to clear his head, but the open air brought no peace. The northern field stretched before him, wide and silent. Every step he took toward it felt like walking into the past. The wind stirred the dry grass in small ripples, whispering faintly, almost like voices. When he reached the edge of the concrete slab, he stopped. For a moment, he imagined he could see his grandfather standing there, hat pulled low, watching him with that same stoic expression he wore in every memory. Elias wanted to curse him, to demand answers from the dead, but the anger caught in his throat and turned to grief instead. The man he'd idolized had been part of this, the tunnels, the lies, the hidden city. He dropped to his knees and ran his hand along the edge of the slab. The surface was cool, but underneath he could feel that same faint vibration, steady as a pulse. He closed his eyes and pressed his ear to it. For a moment, he heard nothing. Then, faintly, there came a sound, not mechanical this time, but human. It was like the murmur of distant voices, dozens of them blending together into a single low hum. When he pulled away, the sound stopped, but the vibration continued, deep and relentless. That night, Elias couldn't bring himself to sleep. He sat by the window again, watching the horizon. At some point past midnight, headlights appeared in the distance, 2 sets moving slowly along the road that led to his property. They stopped near the edge of the field. He turned off his lamp and crouched low, watching from the darkened house. The figures that stepped out of the vehicles carried no flashlights, but the faint glow of their dashboard lights revealed their shapes. 3 men, maybe 4, all dressed in dark clothing. They stood together for several minutes, speaking too quietly for Elias to hear. Then one of them walked toward the concrete slab. Elias felt the cold knot of fear tighten in his chest. The man knelt and placed a small object on the ground, something that glimmered briefly before he stepped back. Then there was a pulse of red light, quick and silent, and the device disappeared into the soil as though swallowed by it. The men returned to their vehicles, and without another word, they drove off into the night. He waited until their taillights vanished before he went outside. The air was cool and still, the stars sharp above him. He moved cautiously toward the slab. The surface looked unchanged, but when he held his flashlight close, he saw a faint burn mark where the device had been placed, perfectly circular, no wider than a coin. He touched it. The metal was still warm. Whatever they had done, it was deliberate. He felt like he was living inside someone else's story, one written in secret long before he was born. The next morning, a black sedan appeared at the end of his driveway. A man in a gray suit stepped out and called his name. He was polite, almost gentle, introducing himself as Mr. Decker from the Department of Energy. His voice carried a practiced calm, the kind used to deliver bad news without panic. He told Elias that the land was now under review for potential contamination, and that access to certain areas would again be restricted. When Elias asked what kind of contamination, the man smiled faintly and said, "Just routine monitoring, sir. Nothing for you to worry about." Elias didn't believe him. The man's shoes were too clean, his car unmarked, his language too careful. He noticed how Decker's eyes lingered on the north field, as though measuring something invisible. Before leaving, the man handed Elias a card and said he would be in touch. As soon as the sedan disappeared, Elias drove into town. He stopped by the county archives, a place he hadn't visited in years. The clerk behind the counter, a tired woman with a smoker's voice, helped him find property records from the 1980s. He combed through pages of deeds and maps until he found what he was looking for: a file on Federal Construction Authorization, Northern New Mexico Sector. His property was one of several listed. Others belonged to ranchers who had since died or sold their land. Each record bore the same notation: Phase N12, status classified. He copied down the names and addresses of the others. That night, he called one of the families still living nearby, the Garzas, whose ranch lay 20 miles west. An elderly woman answered, her voice trembling. When he explained who he was and mentioned the tunnels, there was a long silence. Then she whispered, "You found them too." Before he could ask more, she hung up. The following day, Elias drove to their ranch. It was abandoned. The gate hung open, and weeds choked the driveway. Inside the house, he found signs of haste. Drawers pulled out, cabinets empty, a layer of dust over everything. On the kitchen table lay a single photograph. It showed the Garza family standing with two men in suits near what looked like a construction site. In the background was a large metal structure being lowered into the ground. Written on the back in pencil were the words, "1986, Project Begins." He took the photograph and left. The drive home felt endless. Every passing mile deepened the sense that he was uncovering not just a secret project but a forgotten conspiracy, a thread woven through generations of silence and fear. By the time he reached his farm, the sun was setting in a haze of red, painting the world in the color of rust and blood. Inside the house, the air was heavy. He pinned the photograph to the wall beside his grandfather's ledger and stared at them both. The connections were undeniable now. Marcus had known. He had helped build the foundation for whatever lay beneath, whether willingly or under pressure. And now, decades later, Elias had inherited not a farm, but a buried wound that refused to close. He poured himself a glass of whiskey and sat in the dark, listening. The hum returned again, stronger this time, rising from the floorboards. It wasn't just sound, it was movement, a pulse syncing with his heartbeat. He thought of the men who had come in the night, the device they had planted, the government files labeled Phase N12. He realized with a clarity that chilled him that whatever was down there was no longer dormant. The vibration had deepened, spreading outward. The concrete slab was not a tomb, it was a lid, and something beneath it was pushing to get out. When the first tremor rolled through the ground just before dawn, shaking the windows and rattling the dishes in their cupboards, Elias didn't move. He sat perfectly still, waiting for it to stop. It lasted only seconds, but when it ended, the silence that followed felt heavier than ever before. Somewhere beneath his feet, the underground city was awakening, and with it, the ghosts of his family's past had come to claim their due. The tremor came again the next morning, stronger this time, rattling the windows and shaking loose a line of dust from the beams above Elias's head. He stood in the center of the kitchen, gripping the table as the world seemed to pulse beneath his feet. It was brief, no more than 10 seconds, but when it ended, the silence that followed felt wrong, hollow in a way that made the air heavy. The vibration had come not from some distant quake, but from directly below the property, as though something vast and unseen had stirred awake. When it finally subsided, Elias opened the door and stepped outside, half expecting to see cracks running through the ground or dust clouds rising from the north field. But everything looked calm, unchanged. The horizon shimmered under the early heat. The barn stood crooked but still, and the concrete slab lay smooth and pale as bone. The illusion of peace made the unease in his chest all the sharper. For hours he moved through his routines on instinct, feeding the few remaining hens, checking the fences, forcing himself to eat a little breakfast, but his thoughts stayed fixed on the tremor. He couldn't pretend any more that this was something ordinary. The government had sealed that entrance for a reason, and whatever they had left beneath it was still alive, still shifting in the dark. Each time he tried to push the thought away, another memory of his grandfather surfaced. The strange visits from government men in unmarked cars, the way Marcus would go quiet whenever the topic of those years came up. Elias had always thought the silence was guilt over some minor secret, maybe debt or pride. Now he knew it had been something far heavier, something buried under both earth and conscience. By afternoon, the wind picked up and the sky took on a dusty haze. From his porch, Elias could see two vehicles parked on the road far beyond his property line. Black SUVs that didn't belong to anyone local. They sat there for hours, unmoving, their windshields glinting in the sun. He knew they were watching. He didn't approach. He simply stood on the porch until dusk fell, the heat draining from the air. When he finally went inside, the vehicles were still there, their silhouettes motionless against the dying light. Only after midnight, when the wind howled across the plains, did they finally disappear. Sleep came fitfully. At some point in the night, a sound woke him, a faint metallic ringing, almost like the clatter of chains being drawn tight. It came from the direction of the barn. He grabbed his flashlight and jacket and went outside, his boots crunching on the dry soil. The barn loomed ahead, a shadow darker than the rest. As he neared it, the sound stopped. He opened the door slowly, sweeping the light inside. Dust motes swirled in the beam, but everything was still. The rusted tools, the empty troughs, the broken ladder leaning against the wall. Then, his light caught the metal panel he'd found days earlier, the hidden doorway that had led him back underground. It was open again. The sight hit him like a blow. He approached cautiously, heart pounding, and saw fresh footprints in the dirt leading inside, larger than his own, heavier. The air that seeped from the tunnel was colder now, carrying a faint hum beneath it, like the resonance of the distant machinery. He knelt and touched the edge of the doorway. The metal was warm. Whatever was happening down there, it was active again. He hesitated only a moment before stepping through. The tunnel lights flickered to life as they had before, one by one, as though recognizing him. The hum grew louder with each step, filling the narrow passage until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. When he reached the first junction, he stopped and listened. Somewhere ahead, faint but distinct, came the sound of movement. Boots on metal, the echo of voices speaking in low, urgent tones. He couldn't make out the words, but the cadence was clipped, professional. Soldiers. He killed his flashlight and moved quietly toward the sound. The tunnel opened into one of the smaller chambers he had explored earlier. Now it was transformed. Floodlights glared against the walls, illuminating banks of equipment that hadn't been there before. Computers, scanning devices, heavy crates. Men in tactical gear worked in near silence, their faces masked, their uniforms bearing no insignia. They moved with efficiency born of training, unpacking gear, checking monitors, marking walls with chalk. At the center of the room was a large, circular machine, a drilling rig, though unlike any Elias had ever seen. Its base was bolted into the concrete, and cables ran from it into the tunnels beyond. A low vibration pulsed through the floor, emanating from the device itself. He watched from the shadows as one of the men knelt beside the rig, typing into a handheld console. The machine responded with a deep mechanical groan, and a nearby monitor lit up with lines of data. Elias couldn't see the screen clearly, but he caught one word repeated several times. Conduit. Another man approached carrying a sealed metal case. When he opened it, Elias glimpsed the contents, cylindrical devices marked with hazard symbols, explosives, perhaps, or something more precise. Whatever they were doing, it wasn't excavation. It was control. He began backing away, careful not to make a sound, but his boot brushed against a loose bolt. It clattered across the floor, the sound impossibly loud in the stillness. The nearest soldier froze, head snapping toward the noise. Elias turned and ran. Shouts echoed behind him, sharp commands in a language he didn't recognize. Lights flared to life deeper in the tunnel. He sprinted through the narrow passage, the hum of machinery growing louder as he moved. By the time he reached the ladder leading back to the barn, his lungs burned. He climbed fast, bursting into the cool air above, and slammed the door shut behind him. For several minutes he stood there in the dark barn, gasping for breath. No one followed. Outside, the night was silent, but the hum beneath the ground had changed pitch. It was deeper now, slower, almost rhythmic. He stumbled back to the house, locking every door, every window, then sat at the kitchen table shaken. He had seen enough to know the government had never left. They had returned, quietly, to finish whatever work had begun decades earlier. By dawn, the vehicles were back on the road, more of them this time. A helicopter passed low overhead, its blades chopping through the morning air. Dust billowed in clouds across the field. Elias packed a small bag, unsure of what he was preparing for, but knowing he couldn't stay idle. He needed proof, something undeniable that would expose what was happening beneath the surface. He found his old camera, loaded the last roll of film he had, and waited until evening to move again. When the sun dipped low and the first shadows lengthened, he returned to the barn. The metal door was shut now, sealed as if it had never opened, but the dust told a different story. Fresh prints, tire tracks, and the faint smell of ozone. He searched the perimeter, running his hands along the walls until he found another seam, thin but visible, where the boards didn't meet evenly. A hidden panel. He pried it loose with a crowbar and revealed a maintenance shaft narrow enough to crawl through. The air that drifted out was cool, sterile, and alive with a faint vibration. Without another thought, he climbed in. The shaft led into a section of tunnel he hadn't seen before. Here, the walls gleamed with moisture, and heavy cables ran along the ceiling, pulsing faintly with blue light. After what felt like hours, he reached a platform overlooking a vast subterranean space. He froze at the sight. Below him stretched an enormous cavern lined with scaffolding, vehicles, and cranes. In the center stood a circular pit surrounded by machinery. Workers, dozens of them wearing the same black gear he had seen before, moved methodically around it. The air shimmered with heat. From the pit came a steady plume of vapor, rising like breath from the earth itself. Elias raised his camera and snapped several photos, the flash muted by the distance. He zoomed in on the pit. It wasn't a mine or a drill site. It was an opening, perfectly round, descending into darkness so deep it seemed endless. Around its rim, strange symbols had been carved into the concrete, their meaning indecipherable but unnervingly deliberate. Nearby, a sign written in both English and Spanish read simply, "Active conduit, do not interfere." He watched in horrified fascination as two men wheeled one of the cylindrical devices to the edge and lowered it carefully into the pit using a crane. When it disappeared from sight, the floor shuddered slightly and the lights in the chamber flickered. The workers didn't react. They moved with the calm precision of people who had done this before. He realized then that this wasn't discovery, it was maintenance. The underground network wasn't abandoned or forgotten. It was alive, functioning, perhaps even expanding. He stayed until the ache in his knees forced him to move. He crept back through the shaft, emerged into the barn, and sealed it again behind him. Only when he returned to the house and developed the first roll of film did the full weight of what he had seen strike him. The photographs, grainy and imperfect, captured enough: the pit, the machines, the people. It was proof that the tunnels were active and that the government's silence was deliberate. He knew he couldn't keep it to himself any longer. The next morning, he drove to the nearest town and found the only journalist he knew might listen, an old friend of his father's, now running a small independent paper. The man listened in disbelief as Elias explained what he'd seen. When Elias laid out the photographs, the journalist's expression shifted from skepticism to fear. He promised to make copies, to contact trusted colleagues who could verify the images. Elias left the prints with him and returned home, a fragile hope flickering inside him for the first time in weeks. That hope died 3 days later when he drove back into town and found the office empty. The door was unlocked, the lights off, the desks bare. The photographs were gone. There was no sign of the journalist, not even a note. When Elias asked around, no one had seen him since the night before. The fear that had been building in his chest solidified into something cold and heavy. They had taken him. They knew. That evening, the vehicles returned again, this time up his driveway. There were 4 of them, moving without headlights, their engines whisper quiet. Elias watched from the window as the men stepped out. They moved in pairs, flashlights sweeping the house. He didn't wait. He grabbed his bag, his keys, and slipped out the back door into the night. The desert stretched wide and empty before him. The moon hung low, its pale light enough to guide him toward the old creek bed beyond the fields. Behind him, the lights in his house flared, and he heard the unmistakable sound of the front door being forced open. He kept moving. He walked until dawn, following the dry creek until it met the highway. By then, he was exhausted, covered in dust, his mind spinning with thoughts of the tunnels and the men who had vanished into them. He didn't know where he was headed, only that he couldn't go back. Yet, even out here, miles from the farm, he could still feel it, the faint, steady pulse beneath the earth. The hum had followed him, subtle but unrelenting, as if the network below stretched far beyond his land, threading its way beneath towns, highways, and cities. When the first trucks rumbled past on the distant road, Elias turned toward the rising sun and kept walking. He knew now that the secret beneath his farm was no longer confined to that patch of desert. It was bigger, vast, systemic, unstoppable. The tunnels were spreading, fed by unseen hands, connected to something that reached across states, maybe even continents. And the truth he carried, the evidence he had risked his life to find, had been swallowed like everything else. By the time he reached the next town, he looked back once more toward the south. The horizon shimmered in the morning heat, innocent and silent. But he knew that under that stillness, the machines were working, carving deeper into the bones of the earth. The government would keep their secret, and the people above would go on believing the ground beneath them was solid. Elias knew better. It wasn't solid at all. It was hollow, alive, and waiting. The town that Elias reached was little more than a cluster of faded buildings pressed against the desert's edge. A gas station, a diner, a few boarded-up shops, the kind of place where time moved slower or maybe stopped altogether. He arrived there at sunrise, clothes torn, face lined with exhaustion, his boots coated in red dust. The clerk at the gas station looked at him warily as he filled his thermos with coffee and paid in crumpled bills. Elias didn't speak much. He just needed to sit somewhere quiet, somewhere that didn't hum beneath his feet. But even as he walked down the empty street and sat on a bench near the old post office, he could still feel it, the vibration, faint but steady, traveling through the soles of his boots. It was weaker here, like a heartbeat echoing from miles away, but it was there. The earth was still alive beneath him. He stayed in town for 2 days, sleeping in a cheap motel room with peeling wallpaper and a window that looked out onto the desert highway. Every night he thought he'd rest, but sleep came in fragments, broken by dreams of tunnels stretching endlessly beneath the world, of metal walls breathing like lungs. Sometimes he woke with the taste of dust in his mouth, convinced he'd heard voices rising through the floorboards, murmurs too distant to understand, but too real to dismiss as imagination. On the third morning, a local farmer named Jerry offered him a ride to the bus depot in the next county. Elias hesitated, unsure where he wanted to go, but he accepted. They drove in silence for a while, the old pickup rattling along the road. Then Jerry glanced sideways at him and said, "You're from down near Armitage, ain't you? Heard the feds were sniffing around there a while back. Big to-do." Elias didn't answer at first. The mere mention of his hometown made his throat tighten. "Yeah," he finally said. "They were there." Jerry nodded slowly. "Funny thing. A couple nights ago I saw lights on the horizon that way. Bright ones, real low to the ground. Not planes, not cars. Looked like the earth itself was glowing." Elias turned his head sharply toward him. "When?" "Midnight, maybe later," Jerry said. "Didn't last long, but the ground shook a bit. My cows wouldn't calm down all morning after." Elias said nothing more, but inside his thoughts were racing. They were still working out there. The network hadn't stopped. It was growing, expanding further north. Whatever had been set in motion under his land was spreading outward like roots of a buried tree. He thanked Jerry when they reached the depot, but didn't buy a ticket. Instead, he waited until the man's truck disappeared in the distance and then started walking back along the highway toward home. The journey took him the better part of a day. The heat bore down mercilessly, shimmering off the asphalt, but Elias hardly noticed. His mind was consumed by one thought. He needed to see it again, to know what had become of the place that had defined his life. When the sun began to set, the desert turned gold, and far ahead, he saw the faint outline of his land rising out of the haze like an island in a sea of dust. As he drew closer, he noticed that the ground around the old boundary fence had been disturbed. The posts were crooked, the wire slack, and tire tracks cut deep into the soil. His farmhouse appeared intact from a distance, but when he reached the yard, he saw the front door hanging open. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of oil and smoke. Furniture lay overturned, drawers pulled out, papers scattered across the floor. They had been here, whoever they were, and they had searched everything. The silence of the house pressed down on him like a weight. Elias walked through each room methodically, touching walls, checking corners, as if half expecting to find some trace of his old life still alive. But everything that had once given the place warmth was gone. The photographs had been taken from the mantel, the ledger and letters from his grandfather's chest missing. Only the old table remained, its surface scarred and covered in dust. On it lay something he hadn't seen before, a single sheet of paper, folded neatly in half. He opened it and read the words scrawled across it in black ink. "You should have left it buried." His breath caught. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the message was unmistakable. They knew he had come back. The thought chilled him, but alongside the fear came a deeper, more stubborn resolve. Whoever had left that note wanted him gone, but he wasn't leaving again. He had already lost too much: his home, his peace, the truth. If the earth was still moving beneath his feet, he needed to see what was making it move. That night, he stood in the field under a sky heavy with stars. The wind had died completely, and the silence was vast. The concrete slab at the north end of the property looked the same as before, but as he approached, he saw something new. Fine cracks spreading across its surface like veins of glass. He knelt and ran his fingers along them. The vibration was stronger now, steady and alive. Then, from somewhere deep below, came a sound that made his skin crawl. A faint mechanical whine, rising in pitch before fading into silence again. He sat there for a long time, staring at the cracks. The government might have sealed the tunnel, but the earth was undoing their work. The concrete trembled under his hand, a slow, rhythmic pulse, like the beating of a heart. He thought of the word he had seen on those screens underground: conduit. Whatever the tunnels carried, it wasn't just cargo or people. It was energy, movement, something that fed on the planet itself. As dawn crept over the horizon, Elias saw a thin mist rising from the cracks. It smelled faintly of metal and ozone. He backed away slowly, his instincts screaming at him to run, but his curiosity held him in place. The mist thickened, curling into ghostly tendrils that hovered just above the ground before dispersing into the morning air. When the first rays of sunlight hit the slab, the cracks seemed to fade slightly, as though the earth itself were closing its eyes to rest. Over the next few days, Elias stayed close to the farm, documenting everything he could. He wrote down the times of the tremors, the changes in the air, the color of the soil. At night, he sat outside with a flashlight and watched the stars tremble faintly with each pulse of movement below. Once, around midnight, he saw something new: a thin line of blue light running briefly beneath the surface of the concrete, traveling in a perfect circle before vanishing. The pattern repeated 3 times, always at the same interval. It wasn't random, it was deliberate. He thought of contacting someone, another paper, an environmental agency, anyone who might listen, but the memory of the vanished journalist stopped him. Every authority he had trusted had either ignored him or used his silence against him. No, this time he would keep the evidence himself. The land had already taken enough, it wouldn't take his story too. On the 4th night, the tremor that came was unlike any before. It began with a deep rumble that rolled across the valley, shaking the walls of the house and sending ripples through the water in the sink. Then came the sound, a low, resonant moan rising from beneath the ground, lasting several seconds before fading into stillness. Elias rushed outside. The concrete slab was glowing faintly now, a pale bluish light pulsing beneath its surface like veins illuminated from within. He stared, frozen, as a fissure split open down the center with a sharp crack. For a moment, he thought it would keep widening, but it stopped, the light fading as quickly as it had appeared. He didn't sleep after that. Instead, he sat by the window, watching the field until dawn, waiting for the next tremor. But it didn't come. When the sun rose, the ground was quiet again, eerily calm. He walked to the slab and found it cool to the touch. The crack was still there, though, and from its edges seeped a thin trail of dark residue, like oil mixed with ash. He wiped it with a cloth and brought it inside to examine. Under the light, the residue shimmered faintly, as though metallic particles were suspended within it. Whatever it wasn't natural. By noon, the air had changed again. The wind carried a new smell, chemical, acrid, biting at the back of his throat. Birds circled high overhead, their calls sharp and uneasy. From somewhere in the distance came the faint sound of engines growing louder. Elias climbed the porch steps and saw a line of black vehicles approaching from the road. The sight filled him not with fear, but with resignation. They were back to finish what they had started. He stood in the yard as the vehicles rolled to a stop. Men stepped out, dressed in dark uniforms, faces hidden behind masks. The leader approached him slowly, his gloved hand raised in a gesture that might have been meant to reassure. "Mr. Brown," he said, voice muffled by the mask, "you need to leave the property immediately." Elias didn't move. "You tried to bury it," he said quietly. "It's not staying buried." The man's expression didn't change, though his eyes flickered toward the field. "You don't understand what's down there." "I think I do," Elias replied. "I've seen it. I've heard it. And it's waking up." The man hesitated, then nodded to his team. They moved quickly, setting up equipment. Sensors, scanners, tripods with blinking lights. One carried a small drone that lifted into the air with a whine and hovered over the slab. The leader turned back to Elias. "For your safety, you have to go." Elias looked past him towards the field. The air shimmered above the concrete again, faint waves of heat distorting the horizon. Beneath it, the earth began to hum. The vibration grew stronger, spreading through the ground like a living pulse. The men noticed it too. One shouted something into his radio, but his voice was drowned by the rising sound. It was deep and rhythmic, an echo of power moving through the soil. Then, without warning, the slab cracked again, this time all the way across. Light spilled out from below, bright and blinding, forcing everyone to shield their eyes. When the glare faded, the light was gone, and so was the vibration. The men stood frozen, staring at the smoking fissure. The leader barked orders, and they moved to contain the area, unrolling heavy sheets of tarpaulin and sealing the edges with metal clamps. Elias backed away slowly. He didn't need to see more. Whatever had happened wasn't the end. It was a pause, a breath drawn deep by the thing that lived beneath. That night, long after the men had gone and silence returned to the valley, Elias sat alone on the porch. The stars burned cold above him, scattered across a sky too vast for comfort. The farm looked dead again, stripped of everything human, but the air was still trembling faintly, like a heartbeat hidden in the bones of the world. He knew now that it would never stop. The tunnels stretched far beyond his land, a network too deep and too old to be contained by concrete or secrecy. They would dig, and they would seal, and the earth would open again. It always would. As the wind picked up, he felt the vibration through the wood beneath his chair, faint but steady, like something vast breathing under the soil. He closed his eyes and listened. The sound wasn't frightening anymore. It was a truth older than fear, older than men. The ground beneath his feet was alive, restless, waiting. And, as the first light of dawn touched the horizon, Elias Brown understood that no wall, no government, no power on earth could ever bury what was meant to rise. If this story shocked you, don't stop here. Hit subscribe now and turn on notifications so you never miss what comes next. Check out the next video on your screen. It'll change the way you see everything. And if you know someone who needs to see this, share it right now before they find out the truth too late.